My sister married my fiancé after lying that I cheated. Mom said, he was never meant for you anyway. I disappeared without a word. Years later, I pulled up to the family reunion in a $200,000 car while they showed up late. Because their old junker broke down 2 blocks away. Hello everyone. Thank you for being here with me today. Before I begin my story, I'd love to know which city you're joining us from. Please feel free to share in the comments. Now, let me take you into this story. My name's Audrey. I'm 29 now, but the story I'm about to share with you started nearly 7 years ago. I was a 22-year-old college graduate, just starting my first real job, and I was completely, utterly oblivious to just how twisted my own family could be. I grew up in a small suburban town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and a reputation sticks to you like gum on the bottom of your shoe. In our family, there were 2 daughters. My sister Brooke, 2 years older, was the sun, and I was the planet that quietly orbited her. She was the varsity cheerleader, the class president, the one my mom would proudly introduce at parties as my perfect daughter. And then there was me. I was the quiet one, the smart one, if we're being generous. But in our household, brains never, ever won out over charm. My parents, or more specifically, my mom, always favored Brooke. It wasn't subtle. It was the air we breathed in that house. It was in the small things, the everyday cuts that you don't realize are bleeding you dry until years later. I remember one report card in high school. I'd brought home a straight A report, including an A+ in advanced calculus. My mom glanced at it, handed it back, and said, "That's nice, honey. Try to get out of your room more." That same day, Brooke came home with a C in biology, and my mom took her out for ice cream to cheer her up, because, as she explained to my dad later, Brooke is under so much pressure to maintain her social life. Our bedrooms were another testament to it. Brooke's room was a corner suite, painted a soft pink, with a white canopy bed and a walk-in closet. Mine was the small room at the end of the hall, overlooking the neighbors' trash cans. It was the room that was always a little too cold in the winter and a little too hot in the summer. When I asked once if I could paint it a different color, my mom said, "Oh, let's not make a fuss, Audrey. It's just a room." My dad, well, he was a neutral ghost in the background. A kind man who worked a long, thankless job in logistics, but a man who had learned that keeping the peace meant never crossing my mother. I remember catching him in the hallway one night after another fight where my mom had taken Brooke's side. He just looked at me with sad eyes and said, "Just keep your head down, Audrey. It's easier." He wasn't being cruel, he was giving me the only survival advice he knew. So I learned. I learned to make myself small, to dim my own light so hers could shine brighter. I learned that my achievements were inconvenient and my feelings were a bother. It was just easier that way. I loved my sister, or at least, I thought I did. But looking back, I realize I was just conditioned to accept my role as the supporting character in the story of her life. I didn't know then that she wasn't just content to have the spotlight, she was willing to burn down my entire world to make sure she was the only one left standing in it. Just when I'd resigned myself to a life in the shadows, I met Caleb. It happened in the most ordinary way. I was at a little coffee shop downtown, the kind with mismatched chairs and local art on the walls, trying to cram for a final exam. He was at the next table, sketching in a notebook. He was a few years older, a junior architect at a small firm, and he had the kindest eyes I'd ever seen. I dropped a pen, and it rolled under his table. When he handed it back, he smiled, and it was like the whole gloomy room lit up. We started talking, and we didn't stop for 3 hours. He had this way of listening, really listening, that made you feel like you were the only person in the world. He didn't just hear my words, he heard the spaces in between them. We started dating during my senior year of college. As I graduated and moved into the whirlwind of a new corporate job, he was my anchor. Our relationship wasn't flashy. We didn't need grand gestures. We built our world on late-night conversations over cheap takeout, long walks in the park, and the simple comfort of knowing we had each other's back. One night, I was stressing about a presentation at work, and he stayed up with me until 2 a.m., not just keeping me company, but helping me brainstorm, genuinely interested in the boring logistics of my project. He saw the person I was, not the person my family made me out to be. He'd listen to my ideas for a business startup I was dreaming of and say, "Audrey, that's brilliant. You could actually do that." For the first time, I felt seen. Bringing him home was like introducing a new species into a closed ecosystem. My family didn't know what to do with him. My mom, during that first disastrous dinner, grilled him about his career. "Architecture is so competitive, isn't it?" she'd asked, her smile never reaching her eyes. "What's the average starting salary for a junior architect these days? I hope it's enough to build a life on." It was mortifying. Brooke was worse, in a way. She was all polite sweetness on the surface, but there was a cold, calculating look in her eyes. "Audrey is so lucky to have you, Caleb," she'd said, placing a hand on his arm and letting it linger just a second too long. "She's always been so intense. It's good she has someone calm to balance her out." It was a classic Brooke move, a compliment wrapped around an insult. At the time, I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the usual territorial sister thing. Now, I know better. It was the look of a predator studying its prey. She wasn't just looking at my boyfriend, she was looking at something she wanted to take. The first real crack in the facade happened at my college graduation dinner. My parents had booked a table at a nice Italian restaurant. It was supposed to be my celebration, a recognition of 4 years of hard work. My dad gave a sweet, simple toast. Then my mom nudged Brooke. "Brooke, honey, say something." Brooke stood up, glass in hand. She started with, "It's so amazing seeing my little sister graduate." But she quickly pivoted. "It feels like just yesterday I was graduating, magna cum laude, of course." It was such a whirlwind, juggling my presidency duties and my charity work. It really taught me the importance of time management. She went on like that for 5 minutes, barely mentioning me again, until she ended with a joke at my expense. I remember when she couldn't even pass her driver's test on the first try, she laughed, making the whole table chuckle. We were all so worried. But look at her now. A college graduate. Everyone laughed except Caleb. He reached for my hand under the table and gave it a squeeze, a silent message, "I see it. I'm with you." I tried to brush it off. This was just Brooke being Brooke. But it stung, more than usual, to have her diminish my achievement in front of the one person who truly valued it. After Caleb and I moved into our apartment, the strange behavior escalated. One evening, as we were cooking dinner, he showed me his phone. "Hey, your sister texted me today," he said, a confused look on his face. The message read, "Hey you. Just saw a guy wearing that cologne you like. Made me think of you. Hope you're having a good week." My stomach twisted into a cold knot. "She what?" He shrugged. "It's a little weird, right? I only mentioned what cologne I wore once, like, months ago." He tried to laugh it off. Maybe she's just trying to be friendly. But it wasn't friendly. It was a boundary cross. It was a secret little message sent behind my back. That was the moment something inside me started watching, really watching. I started noticing everything. The way her hand would brush his arm when she laughed at one of his jokes. The way she'd bring up inside jokes from their childhood that I wasn't a part of, trying to create an alliance. My mom, either cluelessly or intentionally, became her accomplice. She'd organize a family game night, and somehow Brooke and Caleb would end up on the same team, with Mom cheering them on, while I was paired with my quiet father. It was a slow, creeping poison, designed to make me feel like the third wheel in my own relationship. After one of these nights, Caleb seemed distant. I asked him what was wrong on the drive home. He hesitated. "It's just, your sister. She says things. She told me you two used to fight a lot, and that you can be a little difficult when you don't get your way. My blood ran cold. She wasn't just being friendly. She was actively painting me as the villain in my own story, planting seeds of doubt, one poisonous whisper at a time. Despite the growing unease, I was blissfully in love. I knew Caleb was the one. I'd been quietly saving up, a little from each paycheck, putting it aside for the perfect ring. I didn't want anything flashy. I found a beautiful, simple vintage ring, a small sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds. It was elegant and timeless, just like I felt our love was. I planned a whole weekend trip to a quiet cabin in the mountains, a place I'd found online with a fireplace and a view of the stars. I had the ring hidden in my suitcase. I had the words I would say practiced in my head. I had our whole future planned out. The night before we were supposed to leave, as I was packing, Caleb came and sat on the edge of the bed. He was silent for a long time, just watching me fold a sweater. The look on his face told me something was terribly wrong. "Audrey," he started, his voice so quiet I could barely hear him. "I don't think I can do this." My hands stilled. I thought he meant the trip. "Is it work? We can go another time, it's no big deal." He shook his head slowly. "No. Not the trip." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were hollow. "Us." I just blinked, the word not registering. It felt like a punch to the gut, knocking the air out of my lungs. "What are you talking about?" We were just planning dinner for next week." He wouldn't look at me. His gaze was fixed on a loose thread on the bedspread. "I know about the other guy, Audrey." The words didn't make sense. It was like he was speaking another language. "What other guy?" "Caleb, there is no other guy." He finally looked up, and his eyes were filled with a pain that physically hurt me to see. "Don't lie to me. Please," his voice cracked. "Brooke told me everything." "She didn't want to," she said. "She was crying, trying to protect you. But she said she couldn't watch me get played for a fool." My blood turned to ice. "She showed me the texts, Audrey. The ones you've been sending your coworker for months. The ones where you said you were bored, that you felt trapped." "Texts? What texts?" "Show them to me." I was frantic, my mind racing. This was a nightmare. He shook his head, a single tear rolling down his cheek. "I can't." She deleted them from her phone right after she showed me. She said she didn't want to have that filth on her phone, that she just had to show me the truth. She said she caught you, that you admitted everything and you begged her not to tell me. The world tilted on its axis. The lie was so perfect, so complete. She had created a narrative, shown him manufactured proof, and then erased it so I had nothing to refute. It was my word against the word of the perfect sister who was only looking out for him. I wanted to scream, to shake him, but all that came out was a desperate whisper. "Caleb, look at me. It's a lie. She's lying." I reached for him, but he flinched away. The small movement shattered what was left of my heart. "You believe her, over me?" There was a long, terrible silence. He didn't have to say anything. His silence was the answer. A week later, he moved out while I was at work. He left a key on the empty kitchen counter. My mom called me that night, not to offer comfort, but to deliver the final, twisting blow. "You'll be okay, sweetie," she said in a chillingly calm voice. "He was never meant for you anyway." The 3 months that followed were a gray, featureless blur. I went to work. I came home. I ate food that tasted like cardboard. I slept, but never rested. I was a ghost haunting the apartment that used to be our home. I tried calling Caleb, but he never picked up. I sent him texts, long, rambling pleas, which were left unread. It was like he had ceased to exist. The final blow came on a Tuesday night. I was numbly scrolling through my phone, a habit I'd developed to pass the empty hours, when a text came in from an old college friend. "Hey, you seeing this?" Attached was a screenshot from a Facebook engagement announcement. It was Brooke and Caleb. They were standing in a park, golden autumn leaves all around them. He was smiling, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. She was beaming, her hand placed possessively on his chest, flashing a ring. My ring. The vintage sapphire ring I had picked out. The one that was still hidden in the back of my closet, waiting for a future that would never happen. I realized then that she hadn't just stolen my boyfriend, she had stolen my ring, my proposal, my entire life plan. I stared at the picture for a long, long time. I thought I would finally break, that the dam of grief would burst. Instead, I laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a small, hollow, brittle thing that echoed in my empty apartment. It was the laugh of someone who had finally hit rock bottom and realized there was nowhere to go but up or out. That night, I packed a bag. Not everything, just the essentials. I walked through the apartment, a museum of a life that was no longer mine. I left his favorite coffee mug on the counter. I left the photos of us on the bookshelf. I took one last look around, and then I walked out and didn't look back. I wrote a short email to my boss, quitting my job, effective immediately. I sent a check to my landlord for the next 2 months' rent to break the lease. I went to an ATM and withdrew the few $1,000s I had left in my savings. I drove to a cheap electronics store and bought a burner phone. Then, I drove to the edge of town, took my smartphone out of its cradle, and threw it into a river. I watched it sink into the murky water, taking with it every connection to my old life. I deleted every social media account I had. And then I just disappeared. I got in my used sedan and drove west. I didn't have a destination. I just drove, fueled by coffee and a cold, hard knot of rage in my stomach. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living in Brooke's shadow or shrinking under my mother's disapproval. It was terrifying, and it was the purest form of freedom I had ever known. For 2 years, I was a nomad. I worked a string of odd jobs. I was a bartender in Austin, learning to make a perfect old-fashioned. I was a barista in a hipster coffee shop in Denver. I was even a bellhop at a fancy ski lodge in Colorado, hauling luggage for people richer than I could ever imagine. I lived in cheap motels and rented rooms, and I was profoundly, achingly lonely. But in that loneliness, I found myself. In the quiet evenings, instead of scrolling through other people's lives, I started building my own. I filled notebooks with ideas, business plans, sketches. And one of them, a startup concept for a logistics optimization software I'd dreamed about in college, slowly began to take shape. I taught myself to code from online tutorials, spending hours upon hours in local libraries. I saved obsessively, living on instant noodles and gas station coffee. Bitterness, I learned, when it's channeled right, is one hell of a fuel. 3 years after that, I finally had a breakthrough. I found a partner online, a brilliant programmer from California who shared my vision. We pooled our meager resources, worked 18-hour days, and launched our company. We called it Lucent Tech. For the first year, it was a struggle. We nearly went bankrupt twice. But then we landed our first big client. And then another. And then another. The business started to grow, slowly at first, then like wildfire. By the time I was 28, 5 years after I vanished, I wasn't just doing well. I was quietly, independently wealthy. I had a beautiful home on a lake outside Seattle, a life I had built with my own 2 hands, brick by painful brick. And that's when the past found me. It started with an email, sent to an old college address I rarely used but kept for sentimental reasons. The subject line read, "Family reunion, we miss you, Audrey." I stared at the sender's name, Mom. My hand trembled as I opened it. The email was sickeningly cheerful, a masterclass in toxic denial. It was full of exclamation points and chatty updates about cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. She wrote as if I'd just been on a long vacation. And then came the paragraph that made my stomach churn. The best news is that Brooke and Caleb will be there with their little one. You have a nephew, sweetie. His name is Leo, and he is just the most precious thing. It just wouldn't be the same without you to complete our family picture. I deleted the email without responding. But it was like they had my scent now. A few weeks later, my business partner forwarded me an email from a supposed investor who was being unusually aggressive about setting up a meeting with me directly. Something about the phrasing felt familiar. I had my tech team do a little digging. They traced the burner email address back to an IP address in a public library. In my old hometown. It was Brooke. Posing as an investor to try and get to me. The desperation was pathetic. That's when I decided to call my old college roommate, Miles. He was one of the few people I'd kept in loose contact with, a good guy who had stayed in the area. After a few minutes of catching up, I asked, "Hey, weird question. Have you heard anything about my sister, Brooke, lately?" Miles let out a low whistle. Man, where to even start? It's a train wreck, Audrey. The word is, she's in debt up to her ears. She blew through some inheritance money from your grandmother's side trying to launch some lifestyle influencer brand that completely flopped. They're underwater on their mortgage, and I heard from a buddy that Caleb's car got repossessed last month. The biggest rumor is that he's threatening to file for divorce. He paused, and then delivered the final piece of the puzzle. The craziest part? They moved back in with your parents a few months ago. Of course, they had. Right back into the nest. And your mom, Miles added, his voice laced with pity, she's still spinning the same old story. Tells everyone Brooke is just going through a phase and that Caleb is being difficult. She still talks about her like she's a saint. Nothing had changed. The golden child could do no wrong. And me? I was still the ghost. Until I decided not to be. The family reunion was scheduled for early spring at a rented picnic area in a large public park. According to the email chain Miles had forwarded me, it was a big deal. The kind of event my mother lived for, a chance for social peacocking in its purest form. I knew I had to go. Not for them. For me. The weeks leading up to it were strangely meditative. The white-hot rage I'd carried for years had cooled into a steady, calculated calm. This wasn't about screaming or crying anymore. This was about closing a chapter. I went shopping. I didn't just buy a dress, I commissioned a suit. A dark, tailored power suit from a boutique designer in Seattle. It was the kind of clothing that didn't need to shout to be heard. It whispered power. Then, for the day, I rented a car, a sleek, black, $200,000 Audi sedan. It was an obscene amount of money for a one-day rental, but it wasn't about the money. It was about the statement. It was armor. I booked a suite at a luxury hotel 2 towns over from my hometown and drove down the day before. That night, I didn't sleep much. I just stood at the window, looking out at the distant lights of the town that had spit me out, and I felt ready. The morning of the reunion, I arrived 10 minutes early. The park was already filling up with distant relatives laughing and kids running around. I drove the Audi slowly past the entrance and parked it in a prime spot, in full view of the main pavilion. I stepped out, took my time adjusting my jacket, and made my way toward the gathering. No one recognized me at first. My hair was different, my style was different, but more than that, the way I carried myself was different. I wasn't the timid girl who tried to blend into the wallpaper anymore. I walked with a purpose. I walked straight past the welcome booth, nodding politely at a confused-looking cousin, and casually picked up a glass of iced tea from the refreshment table. Then I heard it. A sharp, collective intake of breath from a nearby table. Audrey? It was my Aunt Michelle, my mom's sister. Oh my God, it is you. Whispers erupted and spread like a virus through the crowd. Heads turned. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. I just smiled politely, gave a small nod, and kept walking until I saw them. My mom, standing near the main table, frozen, a paper plate of potato salad halfway to her mouth. And Brooke, next to her, her face a mask of disbelief that quickly curdled into something else. Resentment. And next to them, holding a small boy's hand, was Caleb. He looked older, wearier, and he was staring at me like he'd just seen a ghost. Just then, my mom's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and her expression soured. I overheard her mutter to my aunt, "It's Brooke. Their car broke down 2 blocks away." I glanced at the gleaming black luxury car I'd parked near the gate. Every eye in that park was on me now. And for the first time in my life, I didn't shrink. I took a slow sip of my iced tea. And I waited for the show to begin. A few minutes later, a beat-up silver minivan that looked like it had been through a war rolled into view. It sputtered as it lurched to a stop at the curb, the engine letting out a final, rattling sigh. Brooke stepped out of the driver's side, looking flustered and furious, slamming the door behind her. She spotted me almost instantly. The smug confidence she always wore was gone, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock. The afternoon went on in waves of excruciating awkwardness. Distant cousins gave me half-hearted hugs, their eyes full of questions they were too polite to ask. My mother tried to act normal, her voice overly bright. "Audrey, sweetie. We're so glad you could come," she chirped, leaning in for a hug that I didn't return. Then came the speeches. My mom stood up, tapping a fork against her wine glass, a practiced smile on her face. "I just want to thank everyone for coming," she began, her tone syrupy sweet. "It means the world to see our whole family finally back together." She paused for effect. "And I especially want to honor my daughters. Brooke, of course, who's had such a challenging year but continues to inspire us all with her strength and resilience." The lie was so bald-faced it was almost impressive. "And Audrey," she continued, her eyes flicking to me, "who surprised us all by showing up after, well, a little time away." I felt every eye in the place swing toward me. She kept going, talking about forgiveness and moving forward. It was a performance, and she was the star. Brooke followed, giving a short, rehearsed monologue about the importance of family ties, glancing at me with a look that was meant to be conciliatory but was filled with malice. I stayed seated. I didn't clap. And then, as the polite applause for Brooke died down, something I never could have predicted happened. Caleb stood up. He walked to the front, holding his son, Leo, by the hand. His face was pale, but his eyes were clear. "I wasn't going to say anything," he began, his voice clear and steady, cutting through the awkward silence. "But since we're all being honest today." Brooke's head snapped toward him. "Caleb, don't." He held up a hand. "No. You've had your turn." My mother's face looked like it was carved from ice. "I've kept quiet for years," Caleb said, his voice growing stronger, fueled by a truth that had been buried for too long. "I've lived with the guilt and the shame of what happened. But seeing Audrey here, I can't pretend anymore. You all believed that Audrey cheated on me. That she was the one who lied, who abandoned us. But none of that was true." The entire park went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. "Brooke lied," he said, his voice cracking slightly. He recounted the story, the whole ugly thing. "She showed me fake texts, fake screenshots. She created an entire story to convince me that Audrey had another man. She told me Audrey was too smart for me, that she'd eventually leave me for someone more successful. She played on every insecurity I had." His eyes found mine across the lawn, and they were filled with a regret so profound it was almost tangible. "And I believed her," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Because I was young, and I was a coward. I let her manipulate me because it was easier than facing my own fears." He looked directly at Brooke, whose face was a mask of pure fury. "You didn't just lie. You destroyed something beautiful. You manipulated everyone just to take what your sister had. He then turned to my mother. And you encouraged her. You told me it was for the best. You sold me on a lie. Finally, he looked back at me, and his voice was thick with emotion. I'm so sorry, Audrey. I know it's too late, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I needed you to know the truth. He stepped down, and without another word, took Leo's hand and walked straight past Brooke and my mother, disappearing into the crowd. After Caleb walked away, no applause followed. No one moved. The silence was absolute, thick with the weight of a truth that had just detonated in the middle of their pleasant family gathering. Brooke stood frozen, her face a grotesque mixture of fury and humiliation. My mother sat down heavily in her chair, looking small and defeated for the first time in her life. And me. I stood up. Calmly, slowly, I walked through the stunned crowd toward the small portable speaker and microphone they'd set up for the toasts. The microphone was still warm from Caleb's hand when I picked it up. For a long moment, I didn't say anything. I just looked out over the sea of familiar faces. The same faces that had once laughed at Brooke's jokes at my expense. The same people who had nodded along when my mom said I was overly sensitive. The same relatives who had sent me off with nothing but silence when I vanished, but who had suddenly found my email address when they heard I had become successful. Now, they stared at me, their mouths slightly open, unsure of what was coming next. I gave them neither an explosion nor an apology. I simply said, I'm not here to clear my name. A faint rustle of discomfort went through the tables. My mom shifted in her seat. That would assume, I continued, my voice steady and clear, that I still cared what any of you thought. I paused, letting the words hang in the air, letting them land. I scanned the tables, making eye contact with my aunts, my uncles, my cousins. I just wanted to see, I said, my voice dropping slightly. I wanted to see if anything had changed in the last 5 years. But it hasn't. You still cheer for the loudest voice in the room. You still defend whoever makes you feel most comfortable. And you still mistake performance for character. My voice was even, but my hands were shaking slightly. Not with anger, not anymore. With release. With the feeling of a heavy weight finally being lifted from my shoulders. I used to think that I just wasn't good enough for this family, I added, looking from my mother's pale face to my sister's trembling one. Turns out, I was just too honest. Then I stepped back. I didn't slam the microphone down. I placed it gently on the table. And I walked away. I didn't wait for a reaction. I didn't care what came next. I walked through the silent crowd, my head held high. I reached my car, the gleaming symbol of a life they knew nothing about. I got in, closed the heavy door, shutting out the noise and the judgment and the years of pain. And I finally exhaled, a breath I felt like I'd been holding for my entire life. If you're still listening, could you do me a huge favor and hit that like button and comment the number 1 down below? It lets me know you gave me a thumbs up and that you're right here with me on this journey. Your support is a massive encouragement for me. So please, comment with a 1, and let me tell you what happened next. Returning to the sterile quiet of my hotel suite that night was surreal. The adrenaline from the reunion faded, and I was left with a strange, ringing clarity. Hearing Caleb speak the truth out loud had been validating, like a pressure valve being released. But as I paced the floor of the suite, a different feeling began to take root. It wasn't enough. The betrayal hadn't just been a moment of jealous cruelty. It had been a calculated campaign. And I needed to know just how deep it went. The next morning, I didn't drive home. I stayed. I opened my laptop and I did something I hadn't allowed myself to do in years. I started digging. I pulled out old bank statements from the years before I left, old emails, old timelines. The patterns were there, hiding in plain sight. But I was an amateur. I needed a professional. I called a man I'd met through one of my investors, a forensic accountant named Arthur. He was a quiet, meticulous man who found stories in numbers. I flew him out the next day. We met in my hotel suite, and for 5 hours, I laid out the entire story, spreading documents across the coffee table. I gave him a simple instruction: find everything. Assume nothing is a coincidence. He took the files and went to work. A week later, he called me back. His voice was grim. "Audrey," he said carefully, "you might want to sit down." It was worse than I ever could have imagined. Brooke's deception went far beyond fake text messages. Arthur had uncovered a digital paper trail that painted a sickening picture. Using my personal information, my social security number, my date of birth, likely stolen from our parents' house where old tax files were kept, she had applied for a small personal loan in my name about a month before the breakup. The loan was denied, thankfully, but the hard inquiry had left a mark on my credit history for years. It was identity theft, plain and simple. He found the original transaction for the sapphire ring. I had paid the deposit, but the final payment and pickup had been signed for by Brooke. She had forged my signature on the final receipt at the jewelry store, claiming she was picking it up for me as a surprise. And the most chilling discovery: days before Caleb broke up with me, someone had initiated an online application to open a joint bank account in my name and Caleb's. The application had failed only because it required in-person verification from both parties. She wasn't just trying to steal my boyfriend. She was trying to steal my identity, my financial future. She was trying to hijack my entire life. I thanked Arthur, hung up the phone, and stared out the window at the city below for a long, long time. The grief was gone, replaced by something cold and hard and clear. I called my lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Sarah. We had discussed this possibility months ago when I first suspected something was off. Sarah had called the potential evidence nuclear-level leverage. "Sarah," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "It's me. Start the paperwork." The game had changed. This was no longer about family drama. This was about justice. Power isn't loud. It's patient. And for the next few weeks, I was very, very patient. While my lawyer, Sarah, began drafting the initial legal filings, a package of pure, distilled karma landed right in my lap. One of the smaller tech companies my firm had quietly acquired 6 months prior was hiring for a new product lead. It was a subsidiary, operating under its own name, and my involvement was known only to the C-suite. One morning, my head of HR forwarded me a short list of candidates for the final round of interviews. And there it was. The third name on the list. Brooke Bennett. I stared at her name, and then I started to laugh. The universe, it seemed, had a flair for the dramatic. Her resume was a work of fiction, inflating her minor roles at previous jobs into grand leadership positions. Her cover letter was a masterpiece of delusion, filled with buzzwords like synergy and scalability. She was applying to be a senior leader at my company. In my empire. I sat with that for a while, a slow, cold plan beginning to form in my mind. It was time, not for an explosion, but for something far more surgical. I called my HR head. "The candidate Brooke Bennett," I said. "I want to handle her final interview personally. Set it up for next Wednesday." I had the meeting set up at our newest branch, a converted loft space downtown that doubled as our innovation lab. It was sleek, intimidating, and entirely disconnected from any public press about Lucent Tech. No names on the door, just frosted glass and a quiet security system that would log her every movement. The day of the interview, I was in a small observation room behind a two-way mirror. I had instructed the interview panel, 2 of my top VPs, to treat her like a serious candidate. Ask her tough questions, I'd told them. Make her sweat. But do not let on who is behind this. I watched, sipping black coffee, as she walked in. She looked different. The years of stress and failure had taken their toll. She was thinner, and there were faint lines of anxiety etched around her eyes. She wore a cheap blazer that didn't quite fit her shoulders. Still, the old arrogance was there. She talked and talked. She spun stories, boasted about her brand leadership experience, and took credit for projects I knew for a fact she hadn't even touched. When the interview was over, my VPs told her they needed to confer and asked her to wait in the lobby. I told them to stall her for exactly 15 minutes. Just long enough for me to slip out of the observation room and take my place in the corner office upstairs, the one with my name etched subtly on the glass door, Audrey Bennett, CEO. 15 minutes later, there was a soft knock on the office door. My assistant opened it. "Ms. Bennett will see you now," she said. Brooke entered, a fake leather folder clutched in her hands, a nervous, expectant smile on her face. She was probably expecting to meet some tech bro in a hoodie. And then she saw me, sitting behind the large, minimalist desk, my hands steepled in front of me. She stopped dead in her tracks. The folder slipped from her fingers, scattering her fictional resumes across the polished concrete floor. She didn't say a word. Just stared, her face draining of all color until it was a pasty, sickly white. I let the silence stretch, letting her stand there in the ruins of her own making. Finally, I leaned back in my chair and gave her a small, slow smile that held no warmth at all. "Hey, Brooke," I said. "Long time." Her mouth opened, then closed again like a fish. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. I didn't realize. This is your company?" "It is," I said, my voice soft but sharp as glass. "I didn't come here to gloat," I lied calmly. "This isn't about revenge. This is about closure." That seemed to snap her out of her shock. A flicker of the old Brooke returned. "Audrey, listen," she stammered, taking a step forward. "I know things got messy back then, but I was in a bad place. I was jealous, okay? I never meant for it to go this far. I was just trying to protect Caleb, I thought you were." "Save it," I said, my voice cutting through her excuses. I stood up, slow and deliberate, and walked around the desk until I was standing just a few feet from her. "You weren't protecting anyone. You lied. You forged documents. You committed fraud. You poisoned my relationship, stole my ring, my name, and then you wore my life like a coat that didn't fit you." She paled, shaking her head. "That's not. You know what the difference between us is, Brooke?" I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "You've spent your whole life needing an audience, needing applause. All I needed was time. And you gave that to me. 5 years of silence. 5 years to build something you will never, ever touch." She looked like she wanted to run, but her feet were cemented to the floor. I walked back to my desk and picked up a thick, leather-bound folder. Inside was everything. A pristine copy of the forged loan application. The transaction record from the jewelry store, with her fake signature circled in red. A printed timeline of her attempts to access my identity, complete with IP addresses. I slid it across the polished surface of the desk. It stopped right in front of her. "I have the originals in a safe deposit box," I said calmly. "And I have the legal team and the funds to drag this through every court in the state for the next decade." She stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. Her head snapped up, a flicker of desperate hope in her eyes when I added, "But I'm not going to do that." "Why?" she whispered. "Because," I said, turning to look out the panoramic window at the city I now called home, "that would make you the center of the story again. And frankly, Brooke, you're not even worth the ink." I didn't look back at her. "You can see yourself out." And I let her walk. No guards, no threats. Just the crushing weight of her own failure. Because what came next wasn't going to be loud. It was going to be devastatingly quiet. She left without another word, closing the heavy office door with a soft click, as if afraid to wake a sleeping beast. She was right to be afraid. the beast was wide awake. The real show began the next morning. At precisely 9 a.m., a legal courier delivered a letter to my parents' house, addressed to Ms. Brooke Bennett. It wasn't a lawsuit, not yet. It was a formal notice of investigation from my lawyer's firm, citing specific state and federal statutes related to identity theft, forgery, and bank fraud. It was worded in cold, professional legalese, but the message between the lines was crystal clear: we see you. We can prove it. And we are ready to bury you. As I predicted, she panicked and called our mother. By noon, my phone, which they had somehow gotten the number for, was blowing up with texts and voicemails. "Please call me," one from my mother read. "This has gone too far." And my personal favorite, "You're still family." I deleted them all without listening. Because the next phase of my plan was already in motion. The house they were all living in, the one my mother was so proud of, was technically under her name. 2 years ago, when I first caught wind from Miles that my mother was draining her retirement funds to prop up Brooke's failing lifestyle, even selling off a small lake house my grandfather had left her in his will as part of her inheritance, I had stepped in. Quietly, legally, through a third-party wealth advisor acting on behalf of a private trust, I made my mother an offer she couldn't refuse. The trust would buy a 50% stake in her primary residence, clearing her debts and giving her cash flow. She signed the papers without ever asking who the silent partner in the trust was. Why would she? She thought I was still some broken girl licking her wounds somewhere. Now, a second letter from a different law firm, the one representing my trust, was delivered to my mother. It informed her that, due to a defaulted clause in the agreement related to using the property to shelter an individual under criminal investigation, a motion was being filed to liquidate the asset immediately. There was no way they could pay off the trust stake. I had just legally taken their roof from over their heads. But even that wasn't the finishing blow. That came through Caleb. I sent him a single, simple message: "If you'd like full and sole custody of Leo, I can help." He responded within an hour. We met at a quiet cafe halfway between our cities. He looked tired, but the haunted look was gone from his eyes. "I don't want your money, Audrey," was the first thing he said. "It's not about money," I replied, stirring my coffee. "It's about that kid. He deserves a stable life, away from all of this toxicity." I told him I would fund the entire legal battle. I would provide him with the best family lawyer in the state. I even offered to set up a college fund for Leo, ensuring his future was secure. Tears welled in Caleb's eyes. "Why would you do this?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger or hurt. I just felt a quiet resolve. "Because you're the only one who ever told the truth." 2 months later, the custody hearing was a formality. Brooke showed up alone and unprepared. Caleb, backed by a powerhouse legal team, left with full and sole custody of his son. Brooke was left with nothing but the consequences of her own actions. The final stroke wasn't delivered by a lawyer, but by the local newspaper. They ran a glowing, full-page profile on Lucent Tech and its mysterious, successful founder. It was a story about resilience, about overcoming obstacles, about building an empire from scratch. And right there, in a small sidebar about my personal journey, was a carefully worded, lawyer-approved paragraph about leaving my hometown after a deep personal betrayal involving financial fraud and identity theft by a close family member. It mentioned that legal action was being explored. Brooke Bennett's name wasn't in the article, but it didn't need to be. In our small town, everyone knew. The fallout was slow, thorough, and devastating. The few friends Brooke had left stopped returning her calls. The small businesses that had once hired her for freelance work suddenly had no projects available. My mother, realizing the house was no longer salvageable, was forced to sell it in a hurry. It went for a fraction of what it was worth. She moved into a cramped, depressing 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town, far from the neighborhood where she'd once hosted garden parties and bragged about her perfect daughter. Her social ruin was absolute. I heard from Miles that she was at the grocery store one day and an old friend, a woman she'd known for 30 years, saw her, turned her cart, and walked quickly down another aisle. The shame didn't hit her all at once. It chipped away at her slowly, in 1,000 quiet snubs. She tried calling me one last time. She left a voicemail, her voice thin and brittle. "Audrey, please. Whatever she did, we're still family." But she'd already taught me what family meant to her. I remembered every lesson. And I deleted the message. Brooke, true to form, tried to run. After losing custody, after the article, after the house was sold, she disappeared to another city. But the digital world has a long memory. Employers Googled her name. The newspaper article was the first result. Background checks lit up with red flags. One night, Miles sent me a screenshot. Brooke had started a GoFundMe page. The caption read, "A single mom trying to rebuild her life for her son after some unfair curveballs. Every little bit helps." The picture was a heavily filtered selfie. There was no mention of me, of Caleb, or of the truth. I didn't donate. Neither did anyone else. After 3 weeks, it had raised a grand total of $75. It was the ultimate public humiliation. A few months ago, a plain white envelope arrived at my office. There was no return address. Inside, there was no letter, no note. Just a piece of construction paper folded in half. It was a crayon drawing. A little stick figure with spiky hair and a lopsided smile was holding hands with a taller stick figure in a suit. It was from Leo. I pinned it to the corkboard above my desk. Not because I needed to remember who I was to them, but to remind myself of who I had become despite them. I don't speak about the past often. Not to the press, not to my partners, not even to the people who work beside me every day. Because the revenge, as satisfying as it was, wasn't my origin story. It was just the footnote. The real story was the rebuilding. The real story was the quiet nights spent learning to code, the failed business pitches, the moment I hired my first employee. The real story was the fact that I walked away with nothing but a single suitcase and returned with a name that carried weight. My mother used to say, "You'll regret walking away from your family." But here's what she never understood. I didn't walk away from family. I walked away from people who called themselves family, but who only ever treated me like a stepping stone, a backup plan, a shadow. And I never looked back. Not until that reunion. Not until I pulled up in that car, stepped out in a suit worth more than Brooke's last paycheck, and watched from the hilltop as they arrived late, huddled and sweating because their rusted minivan had broken down 2 blocks away. They limped into the gathering while I stood under the shade, glass in hand, watching them skin the crowd, watching them look for me, and realizing, finally, that I wasn't standing in their shadow anymore. They were standing in mine. Thank you for listening to my whole story. It means a lot to finally be able to tell it. If any of you have gone through something similar, or just want to share your thoughts, please feel free to leave a comment down below. It helps to know you're not alone in this world. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more.